The snow had no memory. It fell on the righteous and the damned alike, blanketing the ridges of the Bighorn Mountains with a divine and terrible indifference. It covered the tracks of the elk and the shallow graves of men, silencing the land with a whisper of pure, cold absolution. For a man like Silas, who lived in a fortress of silence, the snow was a fitting companion. It asked no questions. It offered no judgment. It simply was. His cabin, a grim little box of hewn logs, chinked with mud and regret, stood perched on a spur of land that bled into the vast open maw of the valley. Below, a creek lay frozen solid, a jagged scar of ice named by some forgotten trapper, Sorrowful. It was a name Silas understood. He was splitting wood when he first saw it, a stain against the endless white. Not the deep, vital red of a freshly killed deer, but a darker smudge, a blot of wrongness half a mile distant, near the edge of the creek. He stopped, his axe buried in a round of pine, the cold air searing his lungs. He was not a man given to curiosity. Curiosity was a luxury for those with clean hands and a future they looked forward to. Silas had neither. He had a past that stalked him like a wolf and a future that promised only more of the same cold, the same silence. Still he watched. It did not move. It could be a wolf kill, a coyote huddled against the wind, a shadow cast by the low, bruised purple sun. But it held. A shape that pricked at a part of him he'd long thought dead. The shape of a person. He pulled the axe free, the thunk of the steel echoing in the unnerving stillness. He told himself to go inside, to bolt the door and feed the stove and forget what he'd seen. The things that fell in the snow out here were best left to the snow. It was the law of the high, lonely places. What the mountains claimed, they kept. Interfering was an invitation for the mountains to claim you too, but the stain. It was a prayer unanswered, a final fading question mark on the page of the world. His feet, clad in worn leather boots, moved of their own accord, crunching through the crusted snow. He didn't take his rifle. A rifle was for a threat. This felt like a reckoning. The cold was a physical thing, a beast with teeth that bit at the exposed skin of his face and neck. The wind howled a low, mournful tune through the skeletal arms of the aspens. With every step, a memory tried to surface, a ghost of another winter, another order given, the crackle of carbines and a silence that followed, a silence far more terrible than the noise. He shoved it down, deep into the place where he kept all the things that burned. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. Not a man, too small. A child, curled into a fetal ball. The dark smudge was a buffalo hide wrap, insufficient for the bone-stealing cold. A drift of snow had begun to climb its back, tucking it in for its final sleep. Silas's breath hitched. He saw the spill of jet-black hair fanned out against the snow like a raven's broken wing. He saw the small, still form, and the world tilted on its axis. He knelt, his knees sinking into the powder. He reached out a gloved hand, hesitating for a moment, before touching the shoulder. There was no flinch, no response. He carefully turned the body over. It was a boy, native, no older than 10 winters, if that. His face was a mask of blue-tinged ice, his lips cracked and pale. A thin line of frozen blood traced a path from his temple into his hairline, stark and dark against his dusky skin. His eyes were closed, the lashes frosted with ice crystals. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a shirt beneath the thin hide wrap, clothing meant for a life of movement, not for a frozen vigil on a mountainside. Silas pressed 2 fingers against the boy's neck, under the jawline, searching for the faint, stubborn drumbeat of life. He held his own breath, listening not with his ears, but with the memory of what a pulse should feel like. For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing. Just the cold, dead stillness of flesh. He was too late. The mountains had already claimed this one. He felt a hollow ache spread through his chest, an old familiar grief for a child's life cut short. He started to pull his hand away, to consign the boy to the snow's embrace and walk back to his own empty life. And then he felt it, a flicker. A tremor so faint it was more a question than a beat. Thump, a pause that stretched for an eternity. Thump, a desperate, failing signal from a fortress about to be overrun. The boy was alive. In that single stuttering heartbeat, every law of survival Silas had ever known screamed at him to stand up and walk away. This was not his business. This was not his fight. This was a Lakota child. To touch him, to save him, was to invite a storm. It was to light a beacon on his lonely ridge and announce his presence to a people who had every reason to hate, men with skin like his. He knew the stories. He'd been one of the stories. A soldier in a blue coat, riding under a flag that promised freedom while it delivered slaughter. Helping this boy was an act of suicide. He looked down at the small frozen face, at the delicate line of his jaw, the proud arch of his nose. He saw not a Lakota, not an enemy, not a symbol of the war he'd tried to desert in his own soul. He saw a child. And in the vast, roaring emptiness of Silas's life, that was the one thing he could not turn his back on, not again. He slid his arms under the boy's stiff body, surprised at how little he weighed. He was all bone and spirit, a feather on the verge of being blown away. As Silas lifted him, the boy's head lolled back and a sound escaped his frozen lips. It was not a word, but a sigh, a puff of condensed air so slight it was almost invisible. With it came a whisper, a name murmured. From the depths of a dream, a name not meant for his ears. Totatha, the name hung in the air, a sacred alien sound. It felt heavy, ancient. Silas didn't know what it meant, but he knew it was a key to a door he was not prepared to open. He stood, the boy cradled against his chest, a fragile ember of life against the vast cold anvil of the mountains. He turned his back to the creek, called Sorrowful, and began the long walk back to his barn. Each step a decision, each crunch of snow a betrayal of the solitude that had kept him safe. Overhead, a lone hawk circled in the immense gray sky, its cry a sharp, cutting shriek that sliced through the wind's low moan. It sounded like a warning, or a judgment. Silas didn't know which. He only knew that he had made his choice. The silence was broken, and he had a terrible feeling that the world was about to break with it. He laid the boy in the empty stall of his barn, the one that had once belonged to a mare he'd loved and lost to a bitter winter years ago. The air in the barn was thick with the ghost smells of hay, horse sweat, and old leather. In the corner, near a stack of dusty crates, lay another smell, faint but sharp, the metallic tang of gunpowder from a box of cartridges he'd spilled and never bothered to clean up. The smell made his stomach clench. 2 wounds, 1 shelter. The boy's was a line of frozen blood on his temple. Silas's was a sickness in his soul, a wound that never scabbed over. He looked at the child, wrapped now in 3 of his own wool blankets, and saw the specter of his past. The boy was Lakota. The signs were unmistakable, the cut of his buckskins, the beating on his moccasins, the proud, strong features that even the cold could not entirely erase. Silas had worn a blue uniform for 6 years. He'd ridden under Custer, though not at the end. He'd been part of the campaigns that followed, the brutal grinding pacification of the plains. He'd followed orders. He had loaded his carbine and fired into encampments at dawn. He had seen the faces of women and children in the flash of gunpowder, their expressions of terror burned into his memory like a brand. He had stood on a ridge very much like this one and watched a village burn, the smoke a black stain against a winter sky, just like the boy had been a stain against the snow. One day, he'd refused an order to fire on a group of unarmed women and elders who were surrendering. His sergeant had called him a coward, a traitor. His fist had broken Silas's nose, but Silas hadn't fired. For that single act of defiance, he'd been cast out, dishonorably discharged, a man without a country, without a tribe. He had fled to these mountains to escape the ghosts, but the ghosts had come with him. They lived in the silence, and now one of them was lying in his barn. He built a small, careful fire in the center of the barn's dirt floor, far from the hay. He filled a kettle with melted snow and hung it over the flames. The boy hadn't stirred. His breathing was shallow, a fragile thread that threatened to snap with every passing second. Silas gently unwrapped the buffalo hide the boy had been clutching. It was thin, worn smooth with age, and inside, tucked into a fold, was a single eagle feather, its tip dyed red. A prayer, a sign of kinship. He found the soldier's coat then. It wasn't on the boy, but tucked underneath him, a pad against the frozen ground. A standard issue U.S. cavalry coat, dark blue wool with yellow piping, caked in mud and stiff with frozen blood. A corporal's chevrons were stitched to the sleeve. Silas stared at it, his blood running cold. Where had the boy gotten this? Had he found it, stolen it, or had he taken it from the man who gave him the wound on his head? The coat was another ghost. A piece of his own ugly history lay bare on the dirt floor of his sanctuary. He felt a wave of nausea. He took the coat outside, his movements stiff, and buried it deep in a snowdrift behind the barn, as if hiding a piece of his own sin. Back inside, the warmth was beginning to fill the space. The boy's skin was losing its terrifying waxy sheen. A flicker of life returned to his lips. Silas wet a clean rag in the warm water and gently dabbed at the boy's face, cleaning the grime and the trace of blood. The boy's eyelids fluttered. They opened. For a moment, there was only confusion in the deep, dark eyes. Then, comprehension dawned, followed by a fear so pure and absolute it was like a physical blow. The boy scrambled backward, crab-walking away from Silas until his back hit the rough wood of the stall. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stared, his eyes wide, his small body coiled like a snake ready to strike. The silence in the barn became a living thing, a third presence full of history and hate. The boy's gaze was not that of a child. It was ancient, filled with a sorrow and a knowing that no 10-year-old should possess. He stared at Silas, at his pale skin and light eyes, and in his gaze, Silas saw the reflection of every crime his people had ever committed. He was the monster from the stories, the Wasichu, the white man who took everything. Silas held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace he wasn't sure he had the right to make. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rasp, rusty from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy didn't react to the words. His eyes darted around the barn, taking in the unfamiliar space, the tools hanging on the walls, the saddle slung over a rail. His gaze landed on the fire, and he froze. He stared at the dancing flames, his body rigid, his breath held tight in his chest. It wasn't the mesmerized gaze of a child watching a fire. It was the horrified stare of someone remembering. Remembering fire not as a source of warmth, but as a weapon of annihilation. Remembering the smell of burning hides, of burning homes. Silas understood. He had seen it. The dawn raids, the torches thrown into Tippis. The fire was a terror. He slowly, carefully, reached for the kettle and poured some of the warm water into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the ground and slid it across the dirt floor toward the boy. "Water," Silas said softly. "Drink." The boy's eyes flickered from the fire to the bowl, then back to Silas. Suspicion warred with a desperate animal thirst. For a long minute he did nothing. They were two ghosts under one roof, trapped in a standoff of memory and pain. The boy, a survivor of a fire he couldn't forget. Silas, a participant in a fire he couldn't escape. The silence between them was louder than any scream, a deafening roar of unspoken accusations. Finally, the boy's gaze dropped. He looked at the bowl of steaming water, then back at Silas. He didn't move toward it. He simply lowered his head, his black hair falling forward to hide his face. It was not a gesture of surrender. It was a gesture of profound, unbreachable grief. The barn was no longer a shelter. It was a cage holding two separate worlds of pain, two wounds that could never be healed, under a single silent roof. The days that followed were measured in silence and small gestures. Time stretched and bent, marked only by the shifting light that filtered through the barn's dusty single window. The storm that had been brewing in the mountains finally broke, and for 3 days, the world outside was a swirling vortex of white, isolating them completely. It was a fragile, dangerous truce, an armistice declared by the weather. Silas moved with a quiet deliberation he hadn't known he possessed. He nursed the boy not with skill, but with a desperate, clumsy tenderness. He made a thin broth from a piece of dried venison, leaving it for the boy to find, never watching to see if he ate. He found an old tin of herbal salve, something a woman he had once loved and lost had taught him to make from yarrow and pine sap. He remembered her hands, gentle and sure, as she'd shown him how to crush the leaves, how to render the pitch. The memory was a dull ache, another ghost in a life full of them. He left the salve by the water bowl. The next morning he saw that a small amount was gone, and the cut on the boy's temple, which had been an angry red, looked cleaner, less inflamed. The boy still refused to speak. He remained in his stall, wrapped in the wool blankets, a small, silent sentinel watching Silas's every move. His eyes were like polished stones, revealing nothing, yet seeing everything. He would watch Silas mend a piece of tack, his small hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. He would watch him sharpen an axe, his body tense as if expecting the blade to be turned on him. They were two ghosts, yes, but the shape of their haunting was beginning to change. The raw terror in the boy's eyes had been replaced by a deep, wary watchfulness. He was assessing, judging, on the 3rd day of the storm. The wind died down, and a strange crystalline light filled the barn. Silas sat by the fire, stitching a tear in one of his gloves. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the whisper of the needle through leather. The boy had been unnervingly still all morning. Silas glanced over. The boy was not looking at him. He was staring at the dirt floor, his brow furrowed in concentration. With one finger, he was drawing in the fine layer of ash and dust that had settled near his blankets. Silas stopped stitching. He watched, his heart suddenly tight in his chest. The boy drew a series of lines, circles, and shapes that were anything but childish scribbles. He drew a circle, and inside it, 4 figures with spears. He drew a horse, its legs long and graceful. And then he drew a shape that made the air leave Silas's lungs. A shape with wings spread wide, a hooked beak, and sharp talons. A hawk. Or a falcon. He looked up then, and his eyes met Silas's. There was no fear in them now. There was a question. An offering. He was showing Silas something. A piece of his world, of his name, perhaps. Silas felt a profound shift in the air, a breaking of some invisible barrier. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Acknowledgement, respect. The boy lowered his gaze. Back to his drawing. He added more figures, smaller ones, around the hawk, and then he began to hum. It was the faintest of sounds, a low, melodic chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was not a child's tune. It was ancient, sorrowful, and deeply ceremonial. It had the rhythm of a slow drumbeat, the cadence of a prayer whispered for generations. The melody filled the quiet barn, winding its way around the wooden beams, seeping into the very logs. And Silas realized with a jolt that sent a chill down his spine. The boy was not humming for him. He was not humming for himself. The song was a call. It was directed outward, through the walls of the barn, past the swirling snow, to someone far away. He was humming for someone who was listening. The fragile peace of their confinement shattered. The silence had been a shield. This song was a signal. The quiet before the storm was over. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something coming. The fire seemed to shrink, its light suddenly frail and inadequate. The barn, which had felt like a shelter, now felt like a trap. The boy kept humming, his eyes closed, his small fingers still tracing the image of the hawk in the ash, a silent announcement that he was here, that he was alive, and that his people were being summoned. The dreamlike state was broken, replaced by the stark, terrifying certainty that the world was about to come crashing down on them. Silas looked at the door, half expecting it to be thrown open at any moment. The storm outside had passed, but a far greater one was about to begin. The dawn came pale and quiet. The world was sheathed in a fresh, immaculate layer of snow, the sky a clean, cold slate of gray. The air was so still it felt solid, every sound muffled and absorbed by the white expanse. Silas had not slept. He had sat by the dying embers of the fire, the boy's haunting melody echoing in his mind, a premonition of judgment. The boy was asleep now, a deep, healing sleep, his breathing finally even and strong. For the first time in days, he looked like a child, not an ancient, wounded spirit. Silas stepped outside the barn, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He needed to see, he needed to know. His eyes scanned the horizon, the stark line where the white earth met the gray sky. Nothing, just the silent, snow-laden pines, the vast empty sweep of the valley. A profound, almost unnatural quiet had fallen. The birds were silent, the wind was dead. It was the silence of a held breath. And then he saw him. A single rider, sitting on a black horse on the ridge opposite his cabin, perhaps a mile away. A silhouette, stark and unmoving against the pale light. He wasn't advancing. He wasn't retreating. He was just there, watching, a scout, a harbinger. Silas's heart began a slow, heavy beat, a drum of doom in his chest. He knew this was just the beginning. He did not go back inside. He did not run for his rifle. He stood his ground by the barn door, a lone figure in the immense white landscape, and waited. He had made his choice days ago when he'd lifted the boy from the snow. There was no unmaking it now. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The rider did not move. Then, behind him, cresting the ridge, another figure appeared. And another, and another. They came not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate procession, pouring over the horizon like a dark tide. 10, 20, 50. They fanned out along the ridge, a silent, formidable line of men on horseback, their breath misting in the cold, their forms dark and imposing against the snow. They were armed not just with rifles and lances, but with the crushing weight of their presence. They were a living testament to a history Silas had tried to bury. The land itself seemed to shrink under their gaze. The valley, which had felt vast and empty, was now an arena, and Silas was in the center of it. Then the line of riders parted. A man began to walk down the long, snowy slope toward the cabin. He was on foot. An older man, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe. His hair, long and gray, was braided with otter fur. His face was a mask of chiseled granite, etched with lines of grief and authority. He walked with a slow, measured, and unstoppable purpose, his eyes fixed on Silas. Beside him, walking with a hand on the old man's arm, was a younger man, his face a mixture of fury and concern. As the chief, for he could be nothing else, drew closer, the riders on the hill began to move, a slow, silent wave flowing down the slopes, encircling the cabin, the barn, and the small patch of land Silas called his own. There were no war cries, no whoops, no threats. There was only the soft, rhythmic crunch of hundreds of hooves on snow, a sound that was somehow more terrifying than any battle cry. It was the sound of inevitable judgment. The world had gone quiet. Every beat of Silas's heart was a clap of thunder in his own ears. The chief stopped 20 paces from where Silas stood. The younger man, his eyes burning with a cold fire, stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the frozen air like a shard of obsidian. The words were in Lakota, sharp and accusatory. Silas did not understand them, but he understood the hatred that fueled them. The chief raised a hand, silencing the younger man. He took another step forward, his gaze sweeping past Silas to the barn door, as if he could see through the wood to what lay inside. He looked back at Silas, and his eyes held the weight of 1,000 winters, of 1,000 sorrows. He spoke, and his voice was deep, resonant, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his feet. He did not speak in Lakota. He spoke in clear, heavily accented English, words learned in conflict and treaty, words that carried the weight of betrayal. "You have a boy," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Silas's throat was dry as dust. He could only nod. The chief's eyes narrowed, studying Silas's face, his worn clothes, the way he stood his ground. He was searching for something, reading the story of Silas's life in the lines around his eyes. The younger man spoke again, spitting the words in English this time, his voice thick with contempt. "He is one of ours. You touched one of ours." The accusation hung in the air, absolute and final. This was the ultimate transgression. A white man had taken one of their own. In their world, there was only one possible reason for that, and only one possible outcome. Silas looked from the furious younger man to the stoic, unreadable face of the chief. He saw no mercy there. He saw only history, power, judgment. He thought of the boy, sleeping peacefully inside, unaware of the storm that had arrived for him. He had saved the boy's life only to deliver him to this moment. Slowly, deliberately, Silas lowered himself to one knee in the snow. He bowed his head, his gaze fixed on the ground before the chief's moccasins. It was not a gesture of fear. He had lived with fear for so long it had become a dull, constant companion. This was something else. This was an admission, an acknowledgement of a debt that could never be paid. It was the only truth he had left to offer. It was an act of atonement. The chief did not command them to take him. He did not signal for violence. The circle of warriors remained still, their horses shifting and snorting, the vapor from their nostrils rising like smoke signals in the dawn. The chief, Matonatsin, simply watched the kneeling man, his face betraying nothing. The test had begun. It was not a test of strength, but of spirit. "Stand," Matonatsin said. The word was a command, heavy and absolute. Silas rose, his eyes meeting the chief's. The younger man, whose name Silas would later learn was Wanbli, or Eagle, took a menacing step forward, but Matonatsin's gaze held him in check. The chief's eyes were not filled with the fire of Wanbli's. They were colder, deeper, like a frozen lake that concealed its true depth. "Where did you find him?" the chief asked. "By the creek," Silas said, his voice a rasp. "In the snow, he was near death. The wound on his head? It was there when I found him." Silas paused, the image of the blue cavalry coat flashing in his mind. The lie he was about to tell felt like swallowing glass, but the truth was too dangerous. "I saw tracks, a shod horse. Gone by the time I got there." Matonatsin's eyes searched his, weighing every word. "You were a soldier." Again, not a question. He saw the way Silas stood, the ghost of a military bearing he could not shake. He saw the brand of it in his soul. "I was," Silas admitted. The words tasting like ash, Wanbli spat on the snow. "He wears the face of the men who butchered our women, who burned our lodges. He is a ghost face, father." A dog who ran from his own pack, Mato Natsen did not look at his son. His focus remained entirely on Silas. My son, Chaitin, was lost in the blizzard after the soldiers raided the winter camp of our cousins, the Cheyenne. They killed many. They said it was a mistake. They are always making mistakes. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the words all the more devastating. We thought the boy was taken by the storm, or by the wolves. The first truth fell into place, heavy and sharp. The boy, Chaitin, was the chief's son. The raid he spoke of, Silas knew it. He hadn't been there, but he'd been at the fort when the triumphant soldiers returned, their stories turning his stomach. He had saved the son of a great chief, a man whose people his own had been trying to exterminate for a decade. Why? Mato Natsen asked, the single word cutting to the heart of everything. Why did you not leave him to the snow? It would have been the safer choice. Why? Silas looked past the chief, to the silent army arrayed against the hills. He looked at the grim set of Wanbli's jaw. He looked back at the unyielding face of Mato Natsen. There was no answer that would make sense to them. The truth was a tangle of his own shame, of a memory of another child, his own, lost to fever long ago, of a single moment of defiance that had cost him everything and given him nothing. I have a debt, Silas finally said, the words inadequate. To the land, to the silence. It was a strange answer, and it hung in the air between them. Wanbli scoffed, but Mato Natsen's expression flickered with something other than contempt. It was a flicker of understanding, or perhaps just curiosity. At that moment, the barn door creaked open. Chaitin stood there, blinking in the pale morning light. He was wrapped in one of Silas's gray wool blankets, which dwarfed his small frame. He saw his father, his brother, his people. His face, which had been a mask of stoicism for days, crumpled. A single joyous cry escaped his lips. "Eight! Father!" He ran, stumbling through the snow, and threw himself into Mato Natsen's arms. The chief's granite face broke. He knelt and crushed the boy to his chest, his eyes closing, his body shuddering with a relief so profound it was a silent prayer. Wanbli knelt beside them, his hand resting on his little brother's head, the fury in his face replaced by a fierce, protective love. The silent army on the hill let out a collective sigh, a wave of sound that was pure, unadulterated relief. Silas stood apart, a witness to a reunion he had both caused and had no right to see. He was the outsider, the ghost face. His part in this story was over. Now came the reckoning. Mato Natsen held his son at arm's length, speaking to him in soft, rapid Lakota. Chaitin answered, his small hands gesturing, pointing first at his own head, then toward the woods, and finally, pointing directly at Silas. He spoke with an earnest, childish intensity. As the boy spoke, the mood of the men shifted again. The relief was replaced by a low, dangerous murmur. Wanbli's face darkened once more. Mato Natsen listened intently, his expression growing more complex with every word his son spoke. He looked from Chaitin to Silas, a deep, troubling question forming in his eyes. When Chaitin finished, Mato Natsen stood up, his hand still resting on his son's shoulder. He turned his full attention back to Silas. The air grew tense again, thick with impending judgment. "My son says he was not lost," Mato Natsen said, his voice low and strange. "He says he was fleeing. He says a soldier, a corporal, found him hiding after the raid. The man tried to take him, but Chaitin fought. He struck the soldier with a rock, and the soldier struck him back. The man left him for dead." He paused, his eyes boring into Silas. "My son says he wandered in the storm until he could go no further. Until a man with a face like winter found him." Silas's blood ran cold, the cavalry coat, the corporal's chevrons. He had buried the evidence, but the truth had a life of its own. "But that is not all he says," Mato Natsen continued, his voice dropping even lower, drawing Silas into a vortex of disbelief. Weeks ago, our holy man, old Tashunka, had a vision. He saw Chaitan lost in a great white storm. He saw the spirit of the wolf circling him, waiting. But he also saw a man, a Wasichu, standing between the boy and the wolf. He said this man was not a friend, but a ghost. A soldier who had lost his own shadow. He said this man's hands were stained with blood, but that he would wash them by saving our blood. He said this man would be found on the mountain where the creek weeps, the creek called Sorrowful. The second, impossible truth landed, shattering Silas's understanding of the world. His action was not his own. His choice was not a choice. He was a pawn in a vision, a piece of a prophecy he could not comprehend. He had been walking a path laid out for him by a Lakota mystic he had never met. The absurdity of it, the sheer, terrifying fatalism, struck him dumb. He was not a savior. He was not even a man making a decision. He was a tool. A ghost-faced soldier fulfilling his destiny on a weeping creek. Wanblee stared at Silas, his hatred now mixed with a grudging, confused awe. The warriors on the hill murmured amongst themselves, the story passing through their ranks like a wind through tall grass. They looked at Silas not as an enemy to be killed, but as something other, something strange and sacred and terrifying. "You did not choose to save my son," Mato Natsun said, his voice filled with a powerful, unnerving reverence. "You were chosen. The spirits that guide us are mysterious. They work through the wounded as well as the whole. Sometimes a crooked stick draws a straight line." He took a step forward, and Chaitan, holding his father's hand, took a step with him. They stopped directly in front of Silas. The chief reached out and, with a gesture of immense, startling authority, placed his hand on Silas's shoulder. "You have returned the heart of my people to me," he said. "And for that, a debt is owed, not a debt of blood for blood, but a debt of spirit." He looked back toward the camp. "We will light a fire, and you will stand before it. The spirits have named you in their vision. It is time for men to speak that name aloud. They did not take him as a prisoner. They led him as an honored guest, a paradox walking in their midst." Silas moved as if in a dream, the world having tilted into a place of myth and prophecy. He was surrounded by 100 warriors, their faces a mixture of suspicion, respect, and awe as they escorted him down the mountain and across the frozen valley to their encampment, a collection of tipis nestled in a stand of cottonwoods, its smoke rising to a sky that no longer felt empty, but full of watching eyes. A great fire was lit in the center of the camp, a roaring column of flame that threw sparks high into the twilight sky. The entire village gathered, their faces painted by the dancing light, their expressions solemn and watchful. Drums began to beat, a slow, steady, hypnotic rhythm that was the very heartbeat of the earth. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the bone. Silas stood before the fire, flanked by Wanblee and another warrior. He was sure this was the end. This was a prelude to his death. They had brought him here to make a spectacle of his execution, to offer his ghost-faced life to the spirits as a final balancing payment. He looked at the flames and saw an honorable end, a cleaner death than the one he would have found alone in his cabin, consumed by rot and regret. He saw Chaitan standing with his mother, a graceful, strong-faced woman named Tatewin, her eyes holding the same deep sorrow and resilience as her husband's. She watched him, not with hatred, but with a profound, unsettling intensity. She was reading his soul. Mato Natsun stepped into the circle of firelight. He raised his hands, and the drums fell silent. "A man stands before us," he called out, his voice ringing through the cold air. "A man with the face of our enemies. A soldier who rode under the blue flag that has cast a long dark shadow upon our people." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a low growl of anger and pain. "This man," the chief continued, his voice rising, "found my son Chaitan when the spirits of the storm had claimed him for their own. He took him into his shelter, He warmed him by his fire. He gave him back his life. The crowd was silent now, caught between a history of hate and the story of this single, inexplicable act. Silas felt the weight of their gaze, the weight of their history. He knew what he had to do. This was his one chance to balance the scales, if only by a feather's weight. He took a step forward, his voice hoarse but clear. "I ask for no honor," he said, his words stark in the sudden silence. "I was a soldier. I followed orders that shamed the sky. My hands are not clean. If a debt is owed, it is mine to pay. I offer my life for the hurts my people have caused yours. Let it be done. Let it be finished." He dropped again to his knees, bowing his head, offering his neck to the knife he was sure would come. This was it, the final atonement. He closed his eyes and waited for the end, but the blow never came. Instead, he heard the soft shuffle of moccasins on snow. He felt a presence before him. He opened his eyes. It was Tatewin, Chayton's mother. She knelt in front of him, her face level with his. In her eyes he saw not vengeance, but an ocean of grief, and something else he could not name, mercy. She reached out a hand, and for a terrifying second, Silas thought she held a blade. But her hand was empty. She placed it gently, reverently, on his bowed head. The touch was not a prelude to death. It was a blessing, a fragile, impossible absolution. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled him. A sob tore from his throat. A sound of a dam breaking after a lifetime of drought. The crowd let out a collective gasp. They were witnessing something that defied their understanding of justice. They were witnessing irrational mercy. "You ask for punishment," Tatewin said, her voice soft but strong, carrying to every ear. "But the spirits did not use you as a weapon of their anger. They used you as a vessel of their grace. To kill the vessel would be to insult the gift." She helped him to his feet. He stood, unsteadfast, stripped bare before the entire tribe. Mato Natson stepped forward again, a sacred pipe in his hands. "A fire is not only for death," the chief declared. "It is for birth, for naming. The man who came to this mountain was Silas, a ghost. But that is not the man who stands before us now." He gestured to Silas, he who had a debt and sought to pay it with his own blood. He who was an enemy, but became a bridge. He who returned. The heart that was lost. He raised the pipe to the four directions, then to the sky and the earth. "We will not give you a new life," Mato Natson said, his eyes locking with Silas's. "We cannot. Your life is your own. But we will give you a new name so that the spirits will know you when they see you. It is not a title of honor. It is a burden, a responsibility. You will carry the story of this day. You will be a reminder that even in the deepest winter, a single ember can survive." He turned to the people. "From this day forward, he will be known to us as Wanaki Kapahapi," he boomed. "The ghost who carries." The crowd echoed the name, first tentatively, then with growing power. Wanaki Kapahapi. Wanaki Kapahapi. The name filled the night, carried on the rhythm of the drums, which started again, stronger now, a beat of creation, not destruction. They did not ask him to join their tribe. They did not offer him a wife or a home. They gave him something far stranger, far more profound. They gave him a name, a story, and a purpose that was not his own. He was no longer just Silas, a man running from his past. He was Wanaki Kapahapi, a man tasked with carrying a memory. He stayed for one night. They gave him a place of honor in a tipi, a place he felt he hadn't earned. He was given food, a thick, rich stew that tasted of life and community. No one spoke to him, but he felt their eyes on him, their gazes filled with a complex mixture of fear, respect, and wonder. He was a living myth now, a piece of their oral history. Before the sun rose, Mato Natson came to him. "You cannot stay," the chief said simply. "Your path is a lonely one. It was chosen for you, Silas nodded. He understood. He was a bridge, and a bridge belongs to neither side. Go back to your mountain, Mato Natsun instructed. Live your life, but know that we will be watching. Not as enemies, but as keepers of the other end of the story you now carry. He handed Silas a bundle. Inside was a new pair of winter moccasins, beautifully beaded with the image of a hawk, and a small leather pouch filled with dried herbs and tobacco. An offering. Silas walked out of the camp as the first light touched the eastern peaks. No one said goodbye. But as he began his long trek back up the mountain, he turned and saw the entire tribe standing silently, watching him go. Chayton stood in the front, beside his father, his small hand raised not in a wave, but in a gesture of solemn farewell. Silas did not vanish. He did not die. He returned to his cabin on the ridge, to his life of silence. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of his new name, with the echo of the drums, with the memory of a woman's hand on his head. He was still alone, but he was no longer adrift. He was a guardian, a keeper of a moment when two worlds had collided and, instead of shattering, had forged something new and sacred and strange. He lived on that mountain for 30 more years. He never spoke to the Lakota again, and they never came to his cabin. But he would see them sometimes, a hunting party moving through the valley, a single rider on a distant ridge. They would pause, look up toward his mountain, and move on. They knew he was there, the ghost who carries. Years later, an old man, named Chayton, now a leader of his people, brought his own young son to the valley below the mountain spur. The boy looked up at the high, lonely cabin, a thin wisp of smoke rising from its chimney. "Who lives there, father?" the boy asked. Chayton watched the smoke for a long time, his face filled with a deep ancestral memory. "A story lives there," he said softly. He looked at the hard, unforgiving lines of the mountain, at the silent cabin that held a promise made in the heart of a winter storm. He thought of the man who had asked for death and been given a burden instead, the man who had been their enemy and had become their sacred secret. He pulled his son close, the wind whispering through the pines, and on that wind, he whispered the final truth, the last line of the story that had shaped his entire life, the epitaph that would never be carved on a stone, but would be remembered in the hearts of his people forever. He gave what the others never did, time and blood and silence.